wish to start by saying thank you. Thank you for electing me as president of the African Development Bank on May 28, 2015, right here in Abidjan in this same hall. And Mr. Mambre, who was there at that time, was the minister right here and is here with us today. Thank you for re-electing me in 2020 to a second 5-year term with a historic 100% votes of all the 81 regional and non-regional shareholders, the first ever such in the history of the African Development Bank. Thank you very much. As I have always said, being president of the African Development Bank for me is not a job, it is a mission. Nothing can be greater than to have been given the responsibility, the resources, the mandate, the support, and the platform to help transform Africa, the continent of my own birth. Thanks to you, African heads of state and government, for your incredible support. I made it the hallmark of my presidency with my staff to carefully listen to and for us to understand the needs of your countries and to do all possible within the available resources of the bank to support your economic and development ambitions. Thank you to the people of Africa who daily are our focus. As I say to my staff, the most important part of the African Development Bank is the development part. We must fast-track Africa's development. I am proud that over the past 10 years, collectively, working together, the African Development Bank has been an accelerator of Africa's development. The high fives of the bank to light up and power Africa, to feed Africa, to industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, and improve the quality of life of the people of Africa have been transformational for Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in the past decade, the work of the African Development Bank has impacted the lives of 565 million people. This includes 28 million people with access to electricity, 104 million people with food security, 121 million people with access to improved transport, 128 million people with access to improved health services, 67 million people with improved access to information and communications technology, 63 million people with access to drinking water, and 34 million people with access to sanitation. The bank accelerated regional integration with massive support for infrastructure to support the African Continental Free Trade Area. Over the past 10-year period, under my presidency of the African Development Bank, we would have provided, Your Excellencies, a total of $102 billion in support of Africa. This represents 46% of all the financing of the bank since its establishment in 1964. The African Development Bank financed over $55 billion in support of infrastructure, from roads to rails to airports to seaports to digital and communications, health, water, and sanitation. Let me touch on a few, Excellencies, other projects pertaining to countries of the heads of state here present today. While several can be listed for each country, time does not allow. Nonetheless, the impact of the African Development Bank Group is tangibly felt all across Africa. In Tanzania, we are supporting $3.2 billion standard gauge railway connecting Tanzania to the Democratic Republic of Congo and Burundi. We supported the transport corridor that links Addis Ababa to Nairobi and Mombasa, which today has reduced the time to travel from 3 days to 1 day and expanded trade between both nations by 400%. The bank's last mile connectivity project in Kenya has helped to increase the number of Kenyans connected to national electricity grid from 2.42 million households in 2014 to 9.7 million households in 2024. And this has helped the country to increase electricity access from 36% to 76% over the same period. Also, the Lake Turkana, the wind project in Kenya, is today the largest operational wind power mill in all of Africa. As President Ruto of Kenya said when he conferred me with Kenya's highest national honor, the Chief of the Order of the Golden Heart, a great recognition for the work of the bank. He said, and I quote, "I am proud of the journey we started together 10 years ago. I can see its fruits. Kenyans benefit. Kenyan can feel its benefits." And this is the same all across Africa that I go with my staff. Today, the Kasungula Bridge connecting Zambia to Malawi and Namibia is expanding regional trade in Southern Africa. Since 1974, the collective dream of the people of Senegal and of Gambia was to have a bridge connecting both countries. That dream was realized by the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund. This impressive Senegambia bridge and the 24 kilometers road leading up to it has cut travel down from 2 days to less than 10 minutes. The Port Autonome de Lomé in Togo has expanded and been turned into a major transit port. In Comoros, we supported the construction of roads linking the islands. In Egypt, the bank supported Gabal El Asfar, a wastewater treatment plant. Today, it serves 12 million residents. It is now the largest water treatment plant in Africa, and is set to serve a total of almost 18 million people by 2040. And I was just there about a week ago to see President El-Sisi on that. The bank supported the new Ouarzazate solar complex in Morocco, which is the world's largest concentrated solar power plant at the time of its completion. We launched the Lagos to Abidjan Highway Corridor, for which the African Development Bank is supporting the feasibility studies, and we have mobilized $15 billion in investment interest towards this. In Nigeria, we are implementing the development of special agro-industrial processing zones in 8 states and the Federal Capital Territory. We have mobilized $2.9 billion to support the establishment of these zones in 28 more states of Nigeria. Your Excellencies, we stood by countries when it mattered the most. The countries that were under sanctions to clear their debt arrears to the bank, including Somalia and Sudan, and all of my shareholders are here, and they have been exemplary in understanding and supporting us through that. And today, thanks to their support and the support from the African Development Fund, Somalia is showing tremendous recovery and resilience. Excellencies, thanks to the African Development Fund and the bank's Technology for African Agricultural Transformation, which we call TAT, Sudan, even in the midst of the conflict, is showing remarkable progress towards achieving self-sufficiency in wheat. With our support, it achieves 50% self-sufficiency in wheat in 2023 and 85% by 2024. We are also standing with Zimbabwe to clear its arrears to the bank and other creditors. As champion of the debt arrears clearance process, working with His Excellency former President Chisano, who is here with us, we have supported Zimbabwe, and they are making significant progress. I am pleased that the International Monetary Fund's staff monitor program will soon be concluded. And yesterday we were there. It was such an emotive time to see how far we have come. There's hope ahead. The past 10 years were filled with never-before-seen multiple and simultaneous crises. The COVID-19 to geopolitical tensions emanating from the Russian war in Ukraine, which in turn triggered a global food crisis. At the same time, a global debt crisis and devastating climate change posed untold hardships and challenges. In the midst of this polycrisis, your bank, the African Development Bank Group, strongly supported by its shareholders, stood strong and innovatively supported Africa as it navigated each crisis. Africa survived. Africa was resilient. Africa grew out of them all, and Africa is still standing and standing tall. Thanks for your support. We stood up for Africa when it mattered the most, the COVID-19 crisis. Africa, the continent with the least room to maneuver, was effectively left alone in the midst of the most challenging global crisis it had ever faced in decades. No vaccines, no medicines, no oxygen, no masks, no gloves. As developed countries got second and third COVID-19 booster shots, vaccines, Africa was scrambling for just one shot for its population. With the support of our shareholders, the African Development Bank swung into bold action and launched a $3 billion social bond, the largest ever in world history at that time, to support Africa. We set up a crisis response facility for up to $10 billion for counter-cyclical support for our countries. Walking away from home, my exemplary staff and board of directors, we worked hard and we delivered more for Africa even in the midst of all of that. Today, the African Development Bank Group, Your Excellencies, is implementing a $3 billion program for quality health infrastructure. A $3 billion program again for the development of local pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity in Africa. We created new institutions, such as the African Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation, to enable Africa to gain access to intellectual property rights and to protected technologies and processes for manufacturing vaccines and medicines. We strongly supported African agriculture, and in the process increased Africa's capacity to feed itself. Your Excellencies, in 10 years, our work allowed 104 million Africans to achieve food security and provided 13 million farmers with access to improved agricultural technologies. I see the impact of our work in supporting Africa to avoid a looming food crisis predicted when the war of Russia in Ukraine broke out. The news headlines were awash with predictions of a food crisis in Africa, as the continent stood to lose 30 million tons of food, wheat, maize, and oilseeds imported from Russia and Ukraine. The African Development Bank Group swung into immediate action with a $1.5 billion emergency food production facility. Our Feed Africa plan worked. In just 2 years, Your Excellencies, our work had allowed 14 million farmers across 30 countries to have access to improved seeds and fertilizers. They produced 44 million metric tons of food. That is 14 million metric tons of food than what we were losing from Russia and Ukraine. That's 116% above the target that we set. And the total value of the food, $17.3 billion US dollars. Thanks to the bank's support, Ethiopia increased its agricultural areas, producing heat-tolerant wheat varieties, which grew from 5,000 hectares when we started there in 2018 to over 650,000 hectares by 2023. Today, Ethiopia is self-sufficient in wheat, and in less than 4 years, Ethiopia has become a net exporter of wheat. The landmark Feed Africa Summit, which was held in Dakar, then under President Macky Sall, brought together over 30 heads of state and government who signed the Food and Agricultural Delivery Compact to accelerate food production and food sovereignty in their countries, which was approved unanimously then by the African Union. We mobilized $72 billion globally for Africa's food security, working with our partners. The inspiration of the Feed Africa Summit informed our next bold action to achieve universal access to electricity in Africa. To fast-track access to electricity, the African Development Bank and the World Bank, myself and the president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, we jointly launched what's called the Mission 300 in Dar es Salaam to connect 300 million people in Africa to electricity by 2030. At the Africa Energy Summit in January of this year, we organized, hosted, and co-chaired, along with Our Excellency, President Samia Suluhu Hassan, a historic gathering of over 48 African countries, where leaders unanimously endorsed the Dakar-Dar es Salaam Declaration on Energy Access with the full support of the African Union. Your Excellencies, the declaration marks an unprecedented continental commitment to accelerate energy access through coordinated national actions, regional interconnections, and enhanced investment in renewables and grid expansion. I'm pleased to say, Your Excellencies, that we mobilized $55 billion in support of these national energy compacts. Also, we advanced on providing universal access to clean cooking for women in Africa, with a successful African Clean Cooking Summit held in Paris, again co-chaired by our dynamic president, Madam Samia Suluhu Hassan, and we mobilized $4 billion for clean cooking. I mean, why is it everybody in the world cooks with gas and nobody dies? Why is it that African women are collecting firewood and charcoal and dung to cook? It doesn't make any sense. And by the grace of God, we started dealing with that particular issue. We must be able to have our women cook and cook with pride like anybody else in the world. The African Development Bank launched what's called the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, AGIA, supported by the G7 to mobilize $10 billion for climate-resilient infrastructure all across Africa. We strongly supported the youth and the women. The bank's Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa, AFAWA, approved $2.5 billion in support of over 24,000, in fact it's $2.9 billion, in support of over 24,000 women-owned businesses all across Africa, expanding access of women businesses to finance through 185 financial institutions in 44 countries. And Excellencies, our women in Africa, I mean, I've never seen a bird that flies with two wings. Every bird has two wings. We have to make sure that women in Africa have access to finance, period. In support of the youth and to help unleash their potential, the bank launched what's called the Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks, which will expand access to finance to create youth-based wealth all across Africa. We expanded the voice and participation of civil society. I was with them yesterday. Across all of the bank's projects, we instituted a civil society forum each year to interact, to engage more transparently. Today, rather than being adversaries, we are strategic partners. We significantly strengthened the financial architecture in Africa, thanks to our African Development Fund donors. We raised $8.9 billion for African Development Fund's 16th replenishment. And that is the largest ever in the history of the fund since its establishment in 1973. We innovated and developed a new financial framework that will allow the African Development Fund to mobilize $27 billion from the global capital markets. It's my time here to actually ask that we please thank all of our donors to the African Development Fund, because without that, we'll not be able to be supporting all of these 37 countries. Thank you. The shareholders of the bank showed extraordinary support and confidence in our leadership and management of the bank. When I was first elected president in 2015, the capital of the bank stood at $93 billion. From 2015 to 2025, with the support of our shareholders, we grew the bank's capital from $93 billion to $318 billion. Thank you. We put that expanded capital into remarkable use with unprecedented financial support to all of our African countries. Let me explain for perspectives. Since the establishment of the African Development Bank in 1964 until 2014, its total approvals were $118 billion. However, in the past 10 years alone, under my presidency with our boards of directors and my staff, our total approvals were $102 billion. That represents 46% of all the approvals in the history of the African Development Bank Group. We have also ramped up our disbursements. The total disbursements of the bank group in the last 10 years alone at $59 billion represents almost half of all the disbursements in the history of the African Development Bank Group. These are not just numbers. Thanks to your collective support, this represents a new dynamism, a scale of transformative impact of the African Development Bank Group that at any point in its history, we provided significant financial support to African financial institutions, from commercial banks to regional development finance institutions to multilateral development finance institutions, boosting their capital bases. Under my presidency, with our board of directors and my staff, we set up and built Africa 50 from scratch to what it is today, for which I'm extremely proud. A first-rate private equity infrastructure investment platform with portfolio companies now worth over $7 billion. We work very closely and strongly and supported the African Union. This includes a provision of about $12 million in institutional support, over $17 million to the African Continental Free Trade Area, and over $27 million to the African Center for Disease Control. The African Investment Forum, launched by the bank and its partners in 2018, has since mobilized $225 billion in investment interest in Africa across several projects. Excellencies, the African Development Bank has strongly supported several African countries in tackling the effects of climate change. The African Adaptation Acceleration Program, which we call AAAP, is financing commitments of $25 billion from the bank and in partnership with the Global Center for Adaptation. And I'm glad to say, Your Excellencies, today, it is the largest climate adaptation program in the world. Over the past 10 years, Your Excellencies, the African Development Bank Group has become a global leader in financial innovations that have enabled us to stretch our balance sheets and deliver exceptional impact. The bank led with the use of synthetic securitization in 2015, becoming the first multilateral development bank in the world to do so. The African Development Bank also launched a $750 million hybrid capital in the global capital market in 2024, becoming also the first multilateral financial institution in the world to do so, opening up a new asset class for investors globally. The African Development Bank, your bank, spearheaded, together with the Inter-American Development Bank, the framework to allow the rechanneling of the IMF special drawing rights, SDRs, to multilateral development banks, which we can leverage by 4 to 8 times to provide much-needed financial constitutional financing at scale. Excellencies, the image, the respect, and global confidence in the bank have soared through our active and unprecedented participation in the summit meetings of the G7 and G20. With your backing, as President, along with my colleagues on our board of directors, we have amplified the voice and the needs of Africa at the highest levels globally. As my mandate that you have given me as President of the bank draws to a close, I am extremely proud of the work that we have done and the incredible impact of the bank has had on the daily lives of millions of Africans. This has been a collaborative effort that we all can take pride in. We maintained the stellar AAA credit ratings of the bank for 10 years under very difficult circumstances with your support, with all the 3 global credit rating agencies, from Fitch to Moody's to Standard & Poor's, even in the most difficult times of COVID. And I want to thank all my governors. I knew how many calls I made. I knew how many doors I locked. I knew how many conversations I had. But I knew how much your heart was with us that helped us to survive and to continue to sail despite all the challenges. To you, our governors and countries, I say thank you. Thank you so very much. It was not an easy thing, but I'm extremely grateful to you. Your Excellencies, the independent review of the governance systems of the African Development Bank by our governors asked for in 2020 was completed about 2 months ago. The review showed that the African Development Bank is very well governed, respects the independence of its oversight organs, and is at par with all of its peers globally. In view of all that transpired in 2020, I feel vindicated and enormously happy. I am exceptionally proud of the African Development Group that I lead. We developed a new institution, the African Financial Stability Mechanism, unanimously approved by the African Union to support Africa to refinance its debt on global capital markets, reduce contagion effects of economic shocks, and be the Africa's first financial safety net. The African Development Bank, your bank, is today globally recognized and respected. Your Excellencies, the African Development Bank was ranked as the best multilateral financial institution in the world by Global Finance. Your bank, the African Development Bank, was ranked for 2 consecutive years the most transparent financial institution globally by Public Watch Fund for our sovereign operations, scoring last year 98.8% on the Transparency Index, the highest ever in the history of the Global Transparency Index. And in 2024, the bank achieved its highest income ever in its 60-year history. The African Development Fund, the concessionary financing institution of the bank, ranked second best in the world and higher than all 55 bilateral financing organizations in all developed countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. As I complete my 2 5-year terms as president of the African Development Bank, I am proud of the legacy we are leaving behind, and I say we, it's a collective effort, for my successor, for the bank, and for Africa. We have built a world-class financial institution that will continue to advance Africa's position within a rapidly changing